Good morning and welcome to today's International Space Station Update Hour. Getting a look now inside the flight control room as ground controllers monitor systems on board the International Space Station. The Orbit 2 team is currently on console. They're being led by Flight Director Heather Rarick. And joining her to her right is Capcom Kathy Bolt. International Space Station currently orbiting about 241 statute miles. It's heading on a northeasterly track and will take it over the northern Pacific. On board, the crew of Expedition 30 is wrapping up their first week. Commanding them is NASA astronaut Dan Burbank, veteran of 2 shuttle missions on his first long-duration expedition flight. Joining him are Russian cosmonauts Anton Kaplerov and Anatoly Ivanishin. Crew is wrapping up a busy week, which saw the departure of their Expedition 29 crewmates earlier this week. This was kicked off on Sunday, which saw a change of command ceremony between NASA astronauts Dan Burbank and Mike Fossum, as Fossum formally handed off command of the International Space Station to his astronaut counterpart. This was all in preparation of a Monday undocking and landing, which saw Fossum, Japanese astronaut Satoshi Furukawa, and Russian cosmonaut Sergei Volkov close up the hatch and get in their Soyuz spacecraft and then return home. Also on Monday, Fossum and Furukawa, in addition to their deorbit prep work, stored some medical samples on board the spacecraft for their return home, while Volkov, who was the commander of that Soyuz spacecraft, did some stowage closeout activities, some photography of the external surface of the spacecraft for ground controllers, and then performed all the system activations and comm checks. Here you can see the spacecraft camera as it prepares to undock from the space station. Command was given to undock about 3 minutes before physical separation, as a series of hooks and latches retracted, and then springs on the docking mechanism in the spacecraft pushed it away. While that was going on, Dan Burbank did some biology experiment work and then maintenance on the water recovery system on board the station. Anton Kaplerov did some maintenance work on the Vozduk emergency valves, which is the carbon dioxide scrubber on board the station, and transferred some experiment items to the Soyuz. Helping him on those experiment transfers were Anatoly Ivanishin. Here you can see some footage from the landing site in Kazakhstan. The crew landed at 8:26 p.m. Central Time Monday night, and that was at 8:26 a.m. Kazakhstan time Tuesday morning. You can see them being helped out of their capsule here. Following landing, the crew members went through some standard medical checks before being brought back for a traditional Kazakh welcoming ceremony. And then following this, Fossum and Furukawa got on a NASA jet and headed back to Houston, while Russian cosmonaut Sergei Volkov returned to the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City, Russia. Crew landing in frigid conditions, with the temperatures in the single digits Fahrenheit and wind chills bringing those down to about -10 to -20 degrees. Fossum, Furukawa, and Volkov's landing brought the International Space Station back to a 3-crew rotation, and it will continue that way until the launch of the remaining 3 Expedition 30 crewmates, NASA astronaut Don Pettit, Russian cosmonaut Oleg Kononenko, and European Space Agency astronaut Andrei Kuipers launched to the space station on December 21st. Following that activity on Monday, the crew that remained on board the space station enjoyed an off-duty day as they recovered from their vigorous handover period. Normally these handover periods last about 2 to 3 months, but this crew only had about 6 days, as their launch was delayed by that August 24th failure of a Progress spacecraft, which resulted in an extensive investigation. The only activity that really occurred on Tuesday was a potential debris avoidance activity. A piece of space debris estimated to be about 4 inches in diameter was being tracked. And that was a piece of debris left over from a Chinese satellite that was destroyed back in 2007. And at about 1:06 p.m. Central Time on Tuesday, the crew was notified that they may need to shelter in place in their Soyuz spacecraft. Normally the station is maneuvered out of the way in a debris avoidance maneuver, but due to the elevation and the short period of time ahead of when the conjunction was predicted to possibly take place, there wasn't enough time. Moving out of that off-duty day on Wednesday, Commander Dan Burbank started his day off with a public affairs event talking with CBS News down here on the ground before doing some maintenance work and experiment work on board the International Space Station. He started that day with work on the ISS camera, which stands for the International Space Station Agricultural Camera. That camera is mounted in the Window Observational Research Facility and takes images in both visible and infrared light of vegetated areas in the northern Great Plains region of the United States. These areas include things like growing crops, grasslands, and forests, and is also used to study other dynamic Earth processes around the world. These include melting glaciers, ecosystem responses to seasonal changes, human impacts, and rapid response monitoring of natural disasters. In addition to this experiment work, Burbank worked on the vessel imaging experiment, which evaluates the changes in blood vessel wall properties. Those are affected by the microgravity environment, and also did some work on the BCAT experiment, which explores the formation of liquid crystals in microgravity. He also did some work on the passages experiment. You can see him here setting that up. And this is a test to test how astronauts interpret visual information while they're in microgravity. That microgravity environment having an effect on a number of body systems while the astronauts are on orbit. This one in particular is testing for the effects of that weightlessness on the eye's estimates of visual distance and perceived eye height. These are important functions that can be used in everyday needs, such as determining the passability of a doorway. You can see him setting this experiment up. It's very similar to an eye box that you would see at your local eye doctor's. The astronauts then place their face up to the eye holes, and it takes a number of readings for controllers on the ground. His Russian crewmates on Wednesday participated in their own Russian public affairs event, talking to reporters on the ground, and then did some extensive work inside the Russian segment, doing some coolant leak checks and maintenance, and also working on the Electron system, which is the oxygen generation unit on the Russian side. This is part of the dissimilar redundancy on board the space station, though, as the American segment has its own oxygen generation system. This is to ensure that there are always at least 2 pieces of equipment on board the International Space Station that perform the same functions but in different ways. Moving into Thursday, the crew had a day off for the Thanksgiving holiday and enjoyed a special meal that was prepared for them. And then following that off-duty day brought us into today. Crew began their day at midnight Central Time and started it off at the daily planning conference as they usually do, and then a crew conference with the Russian flight control team, which happens on Friday every week. Dan Burbank is doing some more medical testing and an experiment setup today, working on the Ultrasound 2 system. The ultrasound on board is used for the integrated cardiovascular experiment. Dan Burbank will set up and activate this system and then perform an echocardiogram with guidance from controllers on the ground. This tests for any cardiac atrophy or diastolic dysfunction, again from that microgravity environment, as these astronauts continue to monitor their own bodies, kind of as experiments themselves while they're on board the space station, to give NASA and its partners a better understanding of how astronauts will react to extended durations in space. In addition to this, he'll do some vessel imaging scans with that ultrasound, again testing the blood vessel walls within his body. And then some stowage work with the International Space Station's medical accessory kit. He'll do some water recovery and management system monitoring, looking at the contingency water container, and then get in his 2 hours of exercise, which each crew member is required to get in each day, as well as spending an hour of what the flight control team calls crew orientation, as he is only in his second week of space. An hour is set aside each day for the astronauts to accustom their bodies and their orientation to the microgravity environment on board the International Space Station. Russian cosmonaut Anton Shkaplerov is doing some recovery work on one of the Russian segment's laptops before going into some coolant system maintenance on the Russian service module. He'll then do some observation and photography test sessions, as Earth observations are a major portion of the crew's duties, and since the first crews inhabited the International Space Station, they have utilized it to take tens of thousands of images of both natural and man-made structures on Earth. His fellow Russian cosmonaut Anatoly Ivanishin is doing some fluid loop, which is some more coolant work, in the mini research module on the Russian segment, and also doing that crew orientation time and his exercise. At the end of the day, the crew will have another daily planning conference, followed by their weekly flight director and crew conference, and then are scheduled to begin their sleep period at 2:30 p.m. Central Time, rounding out the first week of Expedition 30.